Shy Cleaner Girl solves a math problem in 2 minutes. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can stay close and never miss a new story. The clock on Whitmore University's East Tower chimed 11 times, each bell echoing across the marble halls like a funeral dirge. Liana pulled her cleaning cart closer to her body, the wheels squeaking in protest against the polished floors that cost more than most people's cars. She had learned to move like a ghost through these corridors, silent, invisible, forgotten. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something in the air made her skin prickle with an electricity she couldn't name. At 22, Liana had perfected the art of disappearing. Her long black hair was always pulled back in a tight ponytail, hidden beneath a faded baseball cap that had seen better decades. Her uniform, a shapeless gray jumpsuit that hung loose on her small frame, might as well have been a cloak of invisibility. Students rushed past her without a glance, their designer backpacks worth more than she made in 3 months. She pushed her cart toward Hamilton Hall, where the mathematics department held court like kings in their ivory tower. Each step brought back memories she tried desperately to bury. Memories of when she was supposed to be one of them, walking these halls with books instead of bleach, dreams instead of desperation. 3 years ago, Liana had been accepted to Whitmore on a full academic scholarship. Valedictorian of her high school, she had scored in the 99th percentile on every standardized test, her mathematics scores so high that colleges across the country had fought to recruit her. She had been destined for greatness, professors had said, the next great mathematical mind of her generation. Then her mother collapsed at the factory where she worked 16-hour shifts to keep their tiny apartment. Cancer, the doctors said. Stage 3. The medical bills poured in like a tsunami, drowning every dream Liana had ever dared to dream. She dropped out after just 1 semester, trading her textbooks for a mop bucket, her equations for emptying trash cans. The scholarship money went to her mother's treatments. Her future went with it. Now, as she approached the door to Lecture Hall 312, Liana felt that familiar ache in her chest, the one that reminded her daily of everything she had lost, everything she would never be. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle, and for a moment, she almost turned away. But the electricity in the air pulled her forward, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The lecture hall was empty, bathed in the harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look cold and clinical. Rows of seats stretched down toward a massive whiteboard at the front, where tomorrow's brightest students would sit and absorb knowledge that should have been hers. As Liana began dusting the chairs, her eyes drifted to the whiteboard. What she saw there made her blood run cold. Scrawled across the board in Professor Alden's distinctive handwriting was an equation so complex, so impossibly intricate, that it looked more like abstract art than mathematics. But Liana's trained eye could see the beauty in its chaos, the elegant dance of numbers and symbols that told a story only she seemed able to read. She had seen the graduate students huddled around this problem for weeks, their faces twisted in frustration as they attacked it from every angle. She had watched them erase and rewrite, argue and theorize, only to walk away defeated night after night. But as Liana stared at the equation, something extraordinary happened. The numbers began to speak to her, whispering secrets that had been hidden for decades. She could see the solution as clearly as if it were written in flashing neon lights. Her cleaning cloth fell from her trembling fingers. What happened next would change everything. But Liana didn't know that yet. All she knew was that her hand was reaching for the chalk, and there was nothing in the world that could stop her. The question that would haunt her for the rest of the night was simple. What would happen when someone discovered what she was about to do? The answer would either destroy her completely or save her from a life of invisibility forever. But there was no going back now. The chalk was in her hand, and the equation was calling her name. ## Scene 2, the language she was born speaking. Liana's hand closed around the piece of chalk like it was coming home. The familiar weight of it, the slight roughness against her fingertips, sent shivers through her entire body. It had been 3 years since she had held chalk in her hand, 3 years since she had allowed herself this forbidden pleasure. She glanced toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The hallway beyond was empty, silent except for the distant hum of the building's heating system. She was alone with the equation that had tormented Whitmore's finest minds for weeks. The smart thing would be to dust the board and move on. Keep her head down, stay invisible, protect the fragile stability she had built from the ruins of her dreams. That's what the old Liana would have done. The broken girl who had learned that reaching for more only led to having everything ripped away. But as she stared at the equation, something awakened inside her that had been sleeping for too long. This wasn't just mathematics. This was a puzzle, a mystery, a challenge that spoke to the deepest part of her soul, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be brilliant. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Mija, God gave you a gift. Don't let them convince you it's worthless just because you're poor. Liana stepped closer to the board, her reflection ghost-like in its glossy surface. The equation stared back at her, complex and intimidating to most, but to her trained eye, it was like reading a familiar story written in a language she had spoken since childhood. The problem dealt with recursive sequences and their convergence properties, the kind of advanced mathematical theory that most people couldn't even pronounce, let alone solve. But Liana could see the elegant patterns hidden within the chaos, the logical progression that would lead to the answer. She pressed the chalk to the board. The first mark felt like blasphemy, like a servant daring to touch a king's crown. But as the numbers began to flow from her hand, everything else faded away. The cleaning cart, the empty chairs, the harsh fluorescent lights. It all disappeared until there was nothing in the universe except Liana and the mathematics that had always been her truest love. Her hand moved with a confidence that surprised her, writing symbols and calculations with the fluid grace of a dancer. This was more than solving an equation. This was a conversation between her mind and the fundamental laws of the universe. Each step built upon the last, creating a logical pathway that even she hadn't fully seen until this moment. 30 seconds in, she realized she was approaching the problem from an angle no one else had considered. Where others had tried to solve it through brute force calculation, she was finding an elegant shortcut, a mathematical poetry that transformed complexity into simplicity. 1 minute in, her breathing became shallow as the solution began to crystallize before her eyes. This wasn't just any equation. She could see now why it had stumped everyone. It was a variation of a theorem that had puzzled mathematicians for decades, requiring not just technical skill, but genuine mathematical intuition to crack. 90 seconds in, she was in a zone so deep that she forgot she was a janitor wearing a faded uniform in an empty classroom at midnight. She was just a mind in perfect communion with the abstract beauty of pure mathematics, her chalk dancing across the board like it was composing a symphony. At exactly 1 minute and 53 seconds, Liana stepped back from the board. The solution stared back at her, elegant and complete. Where there had been chaos, now there was order. Where there had been confusion, now there was clarity. She had done more than solve the equation. She had revealed its hidden beauty, its secret logic that had been waiting decades for someone with the right eyes to see it. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel what she used to feel, the pure, intoxicating rush of mathematical discovery. The feeling that she was touching something eternal, something that connected her to every mathematician who had ever lived, from ancient Greece to modern universities. Then reality crashed back like a cold wave. What had she done? Her reflection in the board showed a girl in a janitor's uniform who had just solved a problem that graduate students couldn't crack. A girl who was supposed to be invisible, forgettable, beneath notice. She had left evidence of her brilliance scrawled across the board in white chalk, as damning as a confession. Panic rose in her throat like bile. She reached for the eraser, her hand shaking so violently she could barely grip it. She had to erase this, had to pretend it never happened, had to go back to being nobody before someone discovered what she had done. But as she raised the eraser to the board, a voice cut through the silence like a blade. Don't. Liana spun around, her heart stopping completely. Professor Marcus Alden stood in the doorway, his silver hair disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. His piercing blue eyes, usually so composed and controlled, were wide with something that looked almost like fear. He stepped into the room slowly, his gaze never leaving the whiteboard, never leaving the solution that Liana had written in her desperate moment of brilliance. Don't erase it, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Not yet. Liana stood frozen, the eraser still raised in her trembling hand, knowing that her life was about to change forever. The only question was whether that change would destroy her or save her. Hashtag Scene 3. The discovery that changes everything. Professor Marcus Alden had seen many things in his 30-year career at Whitmore University. He had watched brilliant students crack under pressure, witnessed academic fraud that would shame entire departments, and observed the slow death of curiosity in minds that had once burned with mathematical passion. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he was seeing on his whiteboard at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. "Step away from the board," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded lecture halls for decades. But beneath that authority, Liana could hear something else, a tremor of disbelief, maybe even awe. Liana's fingers released the eraser, and it clattered to the floor like a gunshot in the silence. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to disappear, trying to become invisible again. But it was too late for invisibility. The evidence of her brilliance was written across the board in stark white chalk, impossible to ignore. Professor Alden moved closer to the whiteboard, his footsteps echoing in the empty lecture hall. His eyes scanned the solution with the intensity of a scholar examining a newly discovered manuscript. His breathing became shallow, almost labored, as the full implications of what he was seeing began to sink in. "This equation," he whispered, pointing at the original problem, "has been unsolved for 23 years. I wrote it when I was a graduate student at MIT. It was part of my doctoral thesis, the part one could never finish. The part that has haunted me every day since." Liana felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just any equation. This was his life's work, his white whale, the mathematical Mount Everest that had defeated him for more than 2 decades. "I've had some of the brightest mathematical minds in the country work on this," Alden continued, his voice gaining strength and incredulity with each word. "Graduate students who went on to win prestigious fellowships. Professors from Harvard and MIT who consult for NASA. They've all tried, and they've all failed." He turned to face her, and Liana saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than anger or suspicion. She saw wonder. "Who are you?" he demanded. Liana's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. How could she explain? How could she tell this distinguished professor that she was nobody, that she was the girl who emptied his trash can 3 times a week, that she had solved his life's work while dusting chairs? I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I shouldn't have. I'll clean it off right away, Professor. I'm so sorry." "No." The word exploded from him with such force that Liana jumped. "Don't apologize. Don't clean it off. Tell me who you are and where you learned to do this." Tears burned behind Liana's eyes, 3 years of suppressed pain and lost dreams threatening to spill over. "I'm nobody," she whispered. I cleaned the building at night. I wasn't supposed to. I shouldn't have touched your board." Alden stared at her for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. His eyes took in her uniform, her worn sneakers, the cleaning cart she had abandoned by the door. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they created seemed impossible. "You're a janitor," he said slowly, not as an insult, but as someone trying to process an impossibility. "Yes, sir. And you solved this equation in how long?" Liana's voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "Less than 2 minutes." The silence that followed was so complete that Liana could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Professor Alden stared at her as if she were an alien who had just landed in his classroom, then back at the board, then at her again. "This is impossible," he muttered, running his hands through his silver hair. "This solution requires graduate-level understanding of recursive sequence theory, advanced calculus, and mathematical intuition that takes years to develop. You can't just walk in off the street and—" He stopped mid-sentence, studying the solution more carefully. His face went pale as he traced the elegant logical progression she had written. "My God," he breathed. "This isn't just correct. This is brilliant. You've approached it from an angle I never considered. This methodology could revolutionize how we think about convergence theory." Liana felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the intensity of his reaction. Part of her wanted to run, to grab her cart, and flee into the night before this moment could become real. But another part of her, the part she had buried under 3 years of cleaning supplies and broken dreams, was awakening like a flower reaching towards sunlight. "Where did you study?" Alden demanded. "Harvard?" MIT? Princeton? Which professor taught you this approach? The question hit her like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together the fragile shell of composure she had built around her pain. I, I was here, she said, her voice breaking. 3 years ago. I was a student here, but I had to. I couldn't. The tears came then. 3 years of suppressed grief and loss pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. She had tried so hard to be strong, to accept her fate, to make peace with a life of invisibility. But standing in this lecture hall, faced with the mathematical beauty that had once been her world, the pretense crumbled. Professor Alden's expression softened as understanding dawned. He had seen this before. Brilliant students who disappeared, not because they lacked ability, but because life had dealt them impossible hands. What happened? He asked gently. Between sobs, Liana told him. About her mother's diagnosis, about the crushing weight of medical bills, about choosing between her dreams and her family's survival, about watching from the shadows as other students lived the life that should have been hers. When she finished, the lecture hall was quiet except for the soft sound of her crying. Professor Alden stood motionless, processing not just the mathematical miracle he had witnessed, but the human tragedy that had led to this moment. Finally, he spoke. I want to give you another problem, he said quietly. Liana looked up at him through her tears, confused. I need to understand what I'm seeing here, he continued. This could be a fluke, or someone could have helped you, or… He paused, meeting her eyes. Or you could be the most naturally gifted mathematician I've encountered in 30 years of teaching. He walked to a different section of the whiteboard and began writing a new equation, one that looked even more complex than the first. This is a problem I created last week for my advanced graduate seminar, he said. No one has seen it before except me. If you can solve this. He stepped back from the board and gestured to the chalk. Liana stared at the equation, her heart pounding. This was her chance. Maybe her only chance, to prove that she belonged in this world, that the girl who had once dreamed of mathematical greatness was still alive beneath the uniform and the resignation. But as she reached for the chalk, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows in the hallway. Someone who had heard every word, who understood exactly what this discovery could mean, and who had everything to lose if Liana's brilliance was revealed to the world. The stakes had just become higher than either of them realized. Hashtag scene 4, the proof and the trap. The second equation seemed to pulse with life on the whiteboard, its symbols and variables dancing before Liana's tear-blurred eyes. This was different from the first problem, more abstract, more nuanced, requiring not just technical skill, but the kind of mathematical intuition that separated good students from true mathematicians. Professor Alden stood perfectly still, watching her face as she studied the problem. He had designed this equation specifically for his most advanced doctoral students, brilliant minds who had already published papers and won prestigious fellowships. Most of them would need days, if not weeks, to find a solution. Liana wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and stepped closer to the board. As she studied the equation, something magical happened. The chaos of symbols began to organize itself in her mind, revealing patterns and relationships that most people would never see. It was like looking at a Jackson Pollock painting and suddenly seeing the deliberate artistry beneath the apparent randomness. She picked up the chalk. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. The mathematics flowed through her like music, each calculation building upon the last in a symphony of logic and intuition. Her hand moved across the board with increasing confidence, creating a solution so elegant and unexpected that even she was surprised by its beauty. Professor Alden watched in stunned silence as she worked. He had expected her to struggle, to make mistakes, to prove that the first solution had been a fluke or a lucky guess. Instead, he was witnessing something that defied every assumption he had made about mathematical ability and natural talent. For minutes and 37 seconds after she began, Liana set down the chalk and stepped back. The solution was perfect. More than perfect, it was innovative. She had found an approach that was more elegant than anything Alden had imagined, a pathway through the mathematical maze that revealed shortcuts he hadn't known existed. Impossible, he breathed, staring at the board as if it held the secrets of the universe. This is absolutely impossible. From the hallway came the sound of slow, deliberate applause. Both Liana and Professor Alden turned to see Marcus Webb, the department's senior teaching assistant, stepping into the lecture hall. At 28, Webb was everything that academic ambition could produce: polished, articulate, and ruthlessly intelligent. He was also the kind of person who viewed the university as his personal kingdom, where everyone and everything existed to serve his advancement. "Quite a performance," Webb said, his voice carrying a tone that made Liana's skin crawl. "Very impressive indeed." Professor Alden frowned. "Marcus, what are you doing here so late?" "I could ask you the same question," Webb replied smoothly. "I was working late in my office when I heard voices." Imagine my surprise to discover our esteemed department head having a private tutorial with, "What did you say your name was, dear?" The word "dear" dripped with condescension that made Liana feel smaller than she had in years. She could see the calculation in Webb's eyes, the way he was assessing her like a predator sizing up prey. "Her name isn't important," Professor Alden said firmly. "What is important is that she's just solved two problems that have stumped some of our best students." Webb's smile grew wider, more predatory. "Oh, I'm sure she has quite a story to tell. Don't you, dear? About where you learned these solutions." Something in his tone set off alarm bells in Liana's mind. There was a malicious intelligence behind his eyes, a cunning that suggested he already knew more than he was letting on. "What are you implying, Marcus?" Alden demanded. Webb walked casually to the whiteboard, studying the solutions with the air of a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. "I'm not implying anything, Professor. I'm simply observing that these solutions are remarkably similar to work that's been done before." Liana felt her heart sink into her stomach. "What do you mean?" "Well," Webb said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through it with theatrical precision, "it's funny how closely your methodology matches a paper published in the European Journal of Mathematical Analysis just last month. Same approach, same logical progression, same elegant shortcuts." Professor Alden's face darkened. "That's impossible. I would have seen any paper dealing with this theorem." "Would you?" Webb asked innocently. "It was published in a rather obscure journal. Not exactly required reading for our department. But it's amazing what you can find these days with the right internet searches." He showed his phone screen to Professor Alden, who peered at it with growing confusion and concern. Liana felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "I've never seen that paper," she protested, her voice weak with growing panic. "I've never even heard of that journal." "Of course you haven't," Webb said with mock sympathy. "Just like you've never heard of academic integrity policies, I'm sure. Tell me, how long have you been cleaning this building? Long enough to overhear graduate-student discussions? Long enough to photograph whiteboards after classes? Long enough to piece together solutions from overheard conversations and discarded drafts?" "That's not what happened," Liana cried, but she could see doubt creeping into Professor Alden's eyes. Webb was a master manipulator, and he was weaving a story that sounded plausible to anyone who didn't know the truth. A janitor with access to the entire mathematics building, able to observe classes and collect information without being noticed. It was the perfect cover for academic theft. "I think we need to call security," Webb said, his voice heavy with false regret. "Academic fraud is a serious matter, especially when it involves someone who's been granted unauthorized access to university property." "Wait," Professor Alden said, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence Webb had presented was circumstantial but damning, and Alden was a man who had built his career on rigorous proof and logical thinking. Webb had already pulled out his phone to make the call. "Security?" "Yes, this is Marcus Webb from the mathematics department. We have a situation in Hamilton Hall that requires immediate attention." Liana stood frozen in the center of the lecture hall, watching her life collapse around her for the second time. 3 years ago, she had lost her dreams to poverty and family obligation. Now she was about to lose even her basic dignity to a lie she had no way to disprove. But as the security officer's footsteps echoed in the hallway, neither Webb nor Professor Alden noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of Liana's mouth. She had one more card to play. A card that Webb couldn't have anticipated because he had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate deception. The question was whether she would have the courage to play it before it was too late. ## Scene 5. The humiliation and the stand. The security officers arrived like harbingers of doom, their heavy boots echoing through the lecture hall with military precision. Liana had seen these men before during her 3 years of night shifts. Officer Rodriguez, a kind man who sometimes nodded to her in the hallways, and Officer Chun, younger and more serious, who treated every situation like a potential crisis. What seems to be the problem here? Rodriguez asked, his eyes taking in the scene. The distinguished professor, the well-dressed teaching assistant, and the small girl in the janitor's uniform standing beside a whiteboard covered in complex mathematics. Marcus Webb stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had orchestrated this entire scene. Officers, we have a case of academic fraud. This individual has been using her position as a cleaning staff member to steal mathematical solutions and present them as her own work. Liana felt the words hit her like physical blows. Academic fraud. Theft. The accusations hung in the air like poison, contaminating everything she had worked for, everything she had proven tonight. That's not true, she whispered, but her voice was so small in the large lecture hall that it barely registered. Officer Chin pulled out his notepad with the efficiency of someone who had handled many similar situations. Ma'am, we're going to need to see some identification, and I'll need you to step away from the whiteboard. As Liana fumbled for her ID with trembling hands, Webb continued his performance. She's been observed on multiple occasions lingering in classrooms after hours, photographing whiteboards, listening to advanced lectures. We believe she's been piecing together solutions from overheard conversations and stolen materials. I solved those problems myself, Liana said, her voice growing stronger with desperation. Professor Alden saw me do it. He was right here. All eyes turned to Professor Alden, who stood frozen in the center of the moral and intellectual crisis. Liana could see the war playing out across his features, the evidence of mathematical genius he had witnessed with his own eyes battling against the plausible accusations Webb had presented. I saw her write the solutions, Alden said slowly. But Marcus has raised some troubling points about the methodology being previously published. The words felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. The one person who should have believed in her, who had seen her brilliance firsthand, was wavering under the pressure of circumstantial evidence and social expectations. Webb smiled triumphantly. Professor, I know this is difficult. You want to believe in natural talent and academic miracles. But the evidence suggests a more mundane explanation: systematic theft of intellectual property. Officer Rodriguez looked uncomfortable with the situation. Ma'am, you're not under arrest, but we need to escort you from the building while this matter is investigated. University policy requires. Wait, Liana interrupted, surprising everyone with the sudden strength in her voice. She had been backed into a corner, humiliated and accused, but something inside her was refusing to surrender. She walked back to the whiteboard, ignoring the officer's protests. Mr. Webb, she said, her voice carrying a clarity that cut through the tension in the room. You said my solutions match a paper published last month in the European Journal of Mathematical Analysis? That's correct, Webb replied, his confidence unwavering. Then you must know the name of the paper and its author. Webb's smile flickered slightly. Of course. The paper was titled Advanced Convergence Theory in Recursive Sequences by Dr. Alessandro Fontana of the University of Rome. Liana nodded thoughtfully. And you're certain that my methodology matches Dr. Fontana's work exactly? Remarkably similar, Webb said. Too similar to be coincidence. That's interesting, Liana replied, picking up the chalk again. Because Dr. Alessandro Fontana is my mother's maiden name. And the European Journal of Mathematical Analysis doesn't exist. The silence that followed was so complete that everyone could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Webb's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. I don't know what game you're playing, but it's not a game, Liana continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You made up that journal and that paper to discredit me. But you made one mistake. You didn't count on me being able to prove that my solution is completely original. She turned to the whiteboard and began writing again, but this time she wasn't solving an equation. She was doing something far more impressive and far more dangerous. Professor Alden, she said as she wrote, your original theorem assumed a classical approach to convergence theory. But there's a flaw in the foundational logic that no one has noticed for 23 years. Alden stepped closer, his eyes widening as he followed her mathematical reasoning. The assumption that recursive sequences must follow traditional convergence patterns is incorrect when applied to certain nonlinear progressions. Liana continued, her chalk moving with increasing speed and confidence. If you modify the base theorem like this, what she wrote on the board was beyond impressive. It was revolutionary. She wasn't just solving problems. She was correcting decades of established mathematical theory, revealing insights that could reshape entire fields of study. Professor Alden stared at the board with the expression of a man witnessing a miracle. This changes everything. This invalidates 3 papers I published in the 1990s. This means, he trailed off, overwhelmed by the implications of what she had shown him. Webb, meanwhile, was backing toward the door, his elaborate deception crumbling around him like sand castles in the tide. Officers, Liana said quietly, I think you'll find that Mr. Webb has been conducting unauthorized surveillance of cleaning staff, making false accusations, and attempting to interfere with legitimate academic discovery. You might want to check his computer for evidence of academic misconduct. Officer Rodriguez looked from Webb to Liana to the whiteboard covered in mathematics that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics for all he could understand. I think, he said slowly, we might need to call the dean. As Webb's face crumbled into panic and Professor Alden stared at the whiteboard with a mixture of awe and humiliation, Liana realized that she had passed through fire and emerged not as ash, but as something stronger than she had ever been before. The girl who had spent 3 years invisible was about to become impossible to ignore. But the hardest battle was still ahead, proving that brilliance could transcend social class, that genius didn't require privilege, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries came from the most unexpected places. Hashtag Scene 6. The redemption that changed everything. 3 weeks later, the faculty meeting room at Whitmore University had never felt more charged with tension and anticipation. 12 of the most distinguished mathematicians in the country sat around a polished mahogany table that had witnessed decades of academic decisions, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold. Dean Rebecca Morrison, a woman whose steel-gray hair and penetrating intellect had intimidated students and faculty alike for 20 years, sat at the head of the table with a file folder that contained the power to change lives. To her right sat Professor Marcus Alden, who had barely slept since that night in the lecture hall 3 weeks ago. The events had shaken him to his core, not just the discovery of Liana's mathematical genius, but his own moment of doubt, his own failure to immediately defend the brilliant young woman who had solved problems that had stumped him for decades. The investigation into Marcus Webb had been swift and merciless. His computer had revealed a pattern of academic fraud spanning 2 years, stolen research, plagiarized papers, and systematic intimidation of anyone who threatened to expose his incompetence. He had been dismissed from the university within a week, his academic career destroyed by the lies he had spun to destroy others. But the real focus of today's meeting wasn't Webb's downfall. It was the extraordinary young woman who sat quietly in the corner chair that had been brought in specifically for her. Liana, no longer wearing a janitor's uniform, but dressed in a simple blue blouse and black slacks that Dean Morrison had personally purchased for her. Liana looked around the room at faces she had only seen in academic journals and university publications. These were giants in their field, mathematicians whose work had shaped entire branches of scientific knowledge. And they were all here because of her. Professor Alden stood and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room, a whiteboard identical to the one where this entire journey had begun. Colleagues, he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to make a profound announcement. 3 weeks ago, I discovered something that has fundamentally challenged my understanding of mathematical talent and academic potential. He gestured to Liana, who felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. Miss Liana was working as a night custodian in our building when she solved a theorem that has been unsolved for 23 years. She solved it in less than 2 minutes, using an approach so elegant and innovative that it has caused me to reconsider decades of my own research. Dr. Elizabeth Warren from MIT leaned forward in her chair. Marcus, we've all heard rumors about this incident, but rumors have a way of growing in the telling. What exactly are we talking about here? Instead of answering directly, Professor Alden handed Liana a piece of chalk. Miss Liana, he said gently, would you show them what you showed me? Liana stood on unsteady legs, acutely aware that every eye in the room was focused on her. These were people who had spent their entire careers studying mathematics at the highest levels, and she was about to demonstrate her abilities in front of them while wearing an outfit that still smelled faintly of the discount store where it had been purchased. But as she approached the whiteboard, something extraordinary happened. The nervousness melted away, replaced by the familiar calm that came whenever she was in the presence of pure mathematics. This was her language, her home, her truest self. Professor Alden wrote an equation on the board, not one of the problems from that night 3 weeks ago, but something new, something he had created specifically for this moment. It was a problem in advanced topology that would challenge a doctoral student, requiring not just technical skill, but deep mathematical intuition. Liana studied it for 30 seconds, then picked up the chalk. What followed was 15 minutes of the most beautiful mathematics any of them had ever witnessed. She didn't just solve the problem. She transformed it, revealing connections and patterns that illuminated the underlying structure of the mathematical universe. Her work was poetry written in numbers, a symphony composed of logical progressions and elegant proofs. When she finished, the room was absolutely silent. Dr. James Patterson from Harvard was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. In 40 years of teaching, I have never seen mathematical intuition like this. Dr. Sarah Chun from Stanford was frantically taking notes. The approach she's taken to the topological transforms. This could revolutionize how we understand spatial relationships in higher dimensions. Professor Alden nodded slowly. This is why I've called this meeting. Miss Liana doesn't just solve problems. She sees mathematics in ways that the rest of us don't. Her insights have already corrected errors in my own published research and opened entirely new avenues of investigation. He paused, looking directly at Liana with something that might have been awe. I am recommending that Miss Liana be admitted to our doctoral program immediately, with full funding and research assistantship. Furthermore, I am proposing that she be named as co-author on the paper I will be submitting to the Journal of Advanced Mathematics next month, a paper that would not exist without her contributions. The murmur that ran around the table was electric with excitement and disbelief. Dr. Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying Liana with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Miss Liana, the dean said, this is highly irregular. We have admission processes, academic requirements, prerequisites that exist for very good reasons. Liana felt her heart sink. She had dared to hope, but hope was a dangerous thing for someone who had learned that life specialized in crushing dreams. However, Dr. Morrison continued, and Liana's breath caught in her throat. Genius is also highly irregular, and genius should not be bound by conventional processes. She opened the file folder in front of her and pulled out several documents. I have here a full academic scholarship, retroactive to cover the remainder of this semester. I have a research assistantship that will provide you with a living wage while you complete your studies. And I have a letter of recommendation to the National Science Foundation for a graduate research fellowship that would fund your work for the next 5 years. Liana stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. After 3 years of emptying trash cans and mopping floors, after 3 years of watching other people live the life that should have been hers, she was being offered not just a second chance, but a chance to excel beyond her wildest dreams. There is one condition, Dr. Morrison added, and Liana's heart stopped. Yes, ma'am. You must promise me that you will never again doubt your own worth. You must promise me that you will never again hide your light under a bushel basket. The world needs what you have to offer, Miss Liana. We cannot afford to lose you to false modesty or imposter syndrome. Tears streamed down Liana's face as she nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat. If I may, Dean Morrison, Harvard would very much like to offer Miss Liana a position in our graduate program as well. We would be honored to have someone of her caliber in our department. As would Stanford, Dr. Chen added quickly. And MIT, Dr. Warren chimed in. Professor Alden held up his hand with a smile. Colleagues, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but Miss Liana belongs at Whitmore. This is where her journey began, and this is where it should continue. We have the resources and the commitment to nurture her extraordinary talent. He turned to Liana, his eyes soft with something that looked like paternal pride. Besides, he added, she still has work to finish here. The theorem she solved was just the beginning. I believe Miss Liana may be on the verge of discoveries that could reshape our understanding of mathematical reality itself. Dean Morrison stood, and the rest of the faculty followed her lead. Then it's settled, she announced. Welcome to the doctoral program, Miss Liana. Your real education begins now. As the faculty members filed out of the room, many stopping to shake Liana's hand and welcome her to their community, Professor Alden lingered behind. I owe you an apology, he said quietly when they were alone. Professor, you don't. Yes, I do, he interrupted. For 3 weeks, I've been haunted by my moment of doubt. When Webb presented his fabricated evidence, I should have trusted what I had seen with my own eyes. I should have believed in you without reservation. Liana looked at this distinguished man who was apologizing to someone who had been cleaning his office just a month ago. You believed in me when it mattered most, she said softly. You gave me the chance to prove myself. That's more than anyone else has ever done. Professor Alden smiled, and for the first time since that night in the lecture hall, he looked at peace. Miss Liana, he said, I have a feeling that in a few years, I'll be telling people that I was the one who discovered you. And they'll be very impressed that I was smart enough to recognize genius when I saw it. As they walked out of the faculty meeting room together, the professor and his newest doctoral student, Liana felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. She felt like she belonged. 3 months later, Liana walked into Lecture Hall 312 for the last time as a custodian and the first time as a graduate student. The same whiteboard that had changed her life still dominated the front of the room, but now it was covered with her own equations, problems she had created for the undergraduate students she would soon be teaching as part of her research assistantship. She set down her backpack, not a cleaning cart, but an actual student backpack filled with textbooks and research papers, and looked around the lecture hall that had been the site of her greatest humiliation and her ultimate redemption. The early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the rows of seats that would soon be filled with students eager to learn from the young woman who had proven that brilliance could emerge from the most unexpected places. On the whiteboard, she wrote a quote that had become her personal motto. Mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe, and everyone deserves the chance to join the conversation. As the first students began to filter into the classroom, Liana took her place at the front of the room, not as the invisible girl who cleaned in silence, but as Dr. Liana, the mathematician who had taught the world that genius could not be contained by circumstances, silenced by poverty, or destroyed by prejudice. The girl who had once been nobody had become someone impossible to ignore. And this was only the beginning. Outside in the hallway, a small brass nameplate had been installed beside the door, Lecture Hall 312, the Liana Mathematical Discovery Center. Because sometimes, the most profound transformations begin with someone brave enough to pick up a piece of chalk and solve the unsolvable. Sometimes, the most important discoveries are made not by those who were always expected to succeed, but by those who refused to accept that brilliance was reserved for the privileged few. And sometimes, the greatest mathematical proof of all is that human potential cannot be calculated, cannot be predicted, and cannot be contained. Liana had proven that theorem beyond any doubt. The equation was complete. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.